I don't know why it was not given straight away for typing. There was a talk between the mother and Sri Aurobindo about it. Sri Aurobindo might have said that because of copious editions, typing by another person would not be possible. He himself could not make a fair copy. Then the mother suggested my name and brought a thick blue ledger-like book for the purpose. I needed 2 or 3 reminders from the mother before I took up the work in right earnest. Every morning I used to sit on the floor behind the head of Tihi bed, and leaning against the wall, start copying like a student of our old Sanskrit holes. Sri Aurobindo's footstool would serve as my table. The mother would not fail to cast a glance at my good studentship. Though much of the poetry passed over my head, quite often the solar plexus would thrill at the sheer beauty of the images and expressions. The very first line made me gape with wonder. I don't remember if the copying and revision with Sri Aurobindo proceeded at the same time, or revision followed teachy entire copying. The mother would make inquiries from time to time either, I thought, to make me abandon my jogtrot manner or because the newly started press was clamoring for some publication from Sri Aurobindo. Especially now that people had come to know that after the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo was busy with Savitri, they were eagerly waiting for it. But they had to wait quite a long time, for after the revision, when the whole book was handed to the mother, it was passed on to Nolini for being typed out. Then another revision of the typescript before it was ready for the press. Again, I cannot swear if the typing was completed first before its revision or both went on at the same time. At any rate, the whole process went very slowly, since Sri Aurobindo would not be satisfied with Savitri done less than perfectly. Neither could we give much time to it, not, I think, more than an hour a day, sometimes even less. The press began to bring it out in fascicules by cantos from 1946. At all stages of revision, even on press proofs, alterations, additions never stopped. It may be mentioned that the very first appearance of anything from Savitri in public was in the form of passages quoted in the essay Sri Aurobindo, A New Age of Mystical Poetry by Amal, published in the Bombay Circle and later included as Part 3 in Amal's book, The Poetic Genius of Sri Aurobindo. So far the account of the procedure which was followed for working on the 3 books seems approximately correct. We have been considerably helped by some dates mentioned before in the account. But in what follows about the rest of the epic, I am afraid that the report cannot claim as much exactness owing to my lapse of memory. I can sum up the position obtained at this stage by quoting Sri Aurobindo's letter to Amal in 1946. After investigating all the documents available, we have come to the following conclusions about the rest of the books. Book 4, The Book of Birth and Quest, is fairly revised by Sri Aurobindo. Several versions before the end of 1938 have been worked upon. These versions are expansions of much older drafts, one of them possibly dating back to Baroda. The revised version was later corrected and amplified with my help as scribe and has been divided into 4 cantos. In redoing Book V, The Book of Love, Sri Aurobindo took up, at a certain point, an earlier version than that of 1936. There are quite a number of versions with various titles before 1936. Here too, originally there were no different cantos. There are 3 old versions of the Book of Fate of equal length. They were called Canto 2, and fairly short. One of these versions was expanded into enormous length and developed into 2 cantos, the very last touches given almost during the final month of Sri Aurobindo's life. An instance of the expansion is the passage O Singer of the Ultimate Ecstasy, Will is Fate. There was no Book of Yoga in the original scheme of the poem. One old version called Book 3, Death, has been changed into the Book of Yoga. It was enormously expanded and named Canto I. All the rest of the 6 cantos were totally new and dictated. They were all at first divided into cantos with different titles. Apparently all these cantos except the first one are entirely new. I could get no trace of any old versions from which they could have been developed. I am now amazed to see that so many lines could have been dictated day after day, like the Book of Everlasting Day. The Book of Death contains 3 old versions, all called Canto 3. The final version is constructed from one of these, and from another version some lines are taken to be inserted into the Book of Eternal Night. Canto 4, Night, of the early version served as the basis of the Book of Eternal Night. It was revised, lines were added and split into 2 cantos. Then in the typescript further revisions took place. Canto I, first called the passage into the void of night, was changed into towards the black void. Book X, the Book of the Double Twilight, called only Twilight, Canto V in the earlier verse signs of which there are 4 or 5, had no division into cantos. From these early versions a fair number of lines have been taken and woven into a larger version. The old lines are now not always in their original form. Book 11 had 3 old drafts. One which was larger than the other 2 has been used for the final version and was enormously expanded, even whole passages running into hundreds of lines have been added, as I have mentioned before. About the epilogue, except for a few additions, it almost reproduces the single old version. Now we can go into the detailed working procedure of all these later books. I had to take now a more and more prominent part as scribe, for after the completion of the 4th book, the Book of Birth and Quest, from 1944 or so, Sri Aurobindo's eyesight began to grow dim and he didn't want to strain his eyes by going through all the old manuscripts with their faint, small handwriting. So I was asked to bring out these old versions from the drawer. I now had access to all the manuscripts. Most of them were in loose sheets of notebook size written on one side. Unfortunately, no dates were given to suggest when they were written. I was asked to read aloud book by book before him, but I don't remember by what method we proceeded. Did we give a general reading to all the books before we started with the actual working on them individually? Or did we go about systematically finishing one book after another? Perhaps the latter. Taking this procedure to be probable, I was asked when there were more than one version of a book, to read them, sometimes all, sometimes 1 or 2, and selecting out of them the best one. He indicated the lines to be marked in the margin for inclusion. Sometimes lines or passages were taken from other versions too. As I have shown, and as Sri Aurobindo's dictated letter has already hinted, all these books were either thoroughly revised or almost entirely rewritten. As far as I remember, we worked on these drafts in the evening for an hour or so after all the correspondence work was over. He would sit in a small straight-backed armchair where the big armchair now stands, and listen to my reading. The work proceeded very slowly to start with, and for a long time, either because he didn't seem to be in a hurry or because there was not much time left after attending to the miscellaneous correspondence I have mentioned elsewhere. Later on, the time was changed to the morning. After the selections had been made from 1 or 2 versions of a book, let us say the Book of Fate, we were occupied with it. Never was any book, except the Book of Death and the epilogue, taken intact. He would dictate line after line, and ask me to add selected lines and passages in their proper places, but which were not always kept in their old order. I wonder how he could go on dictating lines of poetry in this way, as if a tap had been turned on and the water flowed, not in a jet, of course, but slowly, very slowly indeed. Passages sometimes had to be reread in order to get the link or sequence, but when the turn came of the Book of Yoga and the Book of Everlasting Day, line after line began to flow from his lips like a smooth and gentle stream, and it was on the next day that a revision was done to get the link for further continuation. In the morning he himself would write out new lines on small notebooks called block notes which were incorporated in the text. This was more true as regards the Book of Fate. Sometimes there were 2 or even 3 versions of a passage. As his sight began to fail, the letters also became gradually indistinct, and I had to decipher and read them all before him. I had a good sight and, more than that, the gift of deciphering his hieroglyphics, thanks to the preparatory training I had received during my voluminous correspondence with him before the accident. At times when I got stuck he would help me out, but there were occasions when both of us failed. Then he would say, "Give it to me, let me try." Taking a big magnifying glass, he would focus his eyes but only to exclaim, "No, can't make out." When a book was completed and copied out, it went to Nolini for typing. On the typescript again, fresh lines were added or the order changed. In this respect the Book of Fate gave us a great deal of trouble. Though Sri Aurobindo says in his letter to Amal in 1946 that the book was almost finished, it was again taken up at the end, and many changes were introduced which contained prophetic hints of his leaving the body very probably after he had taken his decision to do so. As I have already recorded, one day after his bath Champaklal observed that Sri Aurobindo was moving his lips. Suspecting that he was probably murmuring lines of poetry, he told him that if he wanted to dictate them, I could take them down. He caught up the suggestion and started dictating. Had there been no suggestion he would have retained them in his memory and dictated them next day, but our routine changed after the mother started going out in the afternoon. Though the hour of work appointed for Savitri and correspondence was shifted to the morning, we could get very little time for Savitri. Many interruptions came in the way. The preliminary work of reading old versions, selections etc., took up much time before we could actually start writing. We find from the letters to Amal even at the end of 1946 the second part of the book had not begun. After that too, the work rolled on in a jog-trot fashion till one day in 1950 he exclaimed, "My main work is being delayed." From about the middle of that year the time was fixed from 11 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. without any break or interruption. Only once in between he would ask for a peppermint pastille and Champaklal was always at hand to serve it. As soon as the clock struck 11 a.m., I was ready with the usual small heap of manuscripts and notebooks, would sit on the floor by his left side, and he would sit on the bed in an expectant attitude, give a glance of welcome and we would start from where we had stopped. Sometimes sitting upright, sometimes leaning on the left side cushion, keeping his gaze in front, he would dictate in a quiet, subdued voice slowly and distinctly, with an English accent. There was no rise or fall or any other dramatic quality in the intonation, it was in the manner of simple prose dictation with end stops, of course. My initiation by him into English poetry rendered the scribe's work congenial as well as convenient. If I missed some words, I would ask again, but sometimes I put down what I thought I heard correct. Later on, after his passing away, experts found the meaning of some words to be dubious, ambiguous, or even wrong. There was faulty punctuation in abundance. Sometimes Sri Aurobindo did not dictate the punctuation and I didn't ask. One couldn't always remind the poet while he was dictating, of the necessity of punctuation, and thus put a curb on his flow. People asked whether I used shorthand for transcribing. There was no need for it at all, for the dictation was very slow and at times halted, waiting for inspiration, I suppose. I don't know what the nature was of Milton's dictation, but one thing was certain, Sri Aurobindo had not Milton's temper, and I didn't suffer his daughter's fate. The tempo of the work was subsequently speeded up and it proceeded smoothly without break till the seal of incomplete completion was put about 2 weeks before the November Dashan of 1950. Very probably he had taken the decision to withdraw from this world of the sad music of humanity and leave in compensation his divine music of Savitri. A curious incident has stuck in my memory. One day he continued working even beyond 1:30 p.m. A rare occurrence, and that was the day I was invited for lunch at a friend's place. I thought I would certainly be free by 2 p.m. but no, he seemed to be unusually inspired. I believe I was showing some signs of restlessness at which he remarked, "What's the matter?" I don't remember whether I kept quiet or told him the truth. He, however, shut shop soon after. This incident reminds me strongly of Champaklal's valuable admonition that those who want to serve the divine must have no personal ties or strings. During this period a long communication that had passed between Amal and a critical friend of his on Savitri as well as on some shorter mystical poems of Sri Aurobindo, was sent to Sri Aurobindo for his opinion or reaction. Amal had also put some questions on beauty and greatness in poetry and whether spiritual poetry could be considered greater than any other. His long illuminating commentary on his own poetry and the detailed answers on the various other topics raised, which were dictated at this time, consumed much of our time, but we could see from the replies how Sri Aurobindo welcomed such discussion from Amal, whom he had prepared in the art of poetry. No one except Amal, or perhaps Ajava had he been alive, could have discussed with Sri Aurobindo almost as equals on English poetry and drawn out many intricate expositions on rhythm, overhead poetry, etc., which are now a permanent treasure in English literature. Sri Aurobindo's quotations from memory from Homer, Shakespeare, Milton and others which he said should be verified were, in most cases, correct. When I read Homer's lines trying to imitate Sri Aurobindo's intonation, but forgetting the quantitative length, he corrected me. That reminds me also of how he encouraged me indirectly to learn the Sanskrit alphabet. I didn't know it, as I learnt Pali in my school. So whenever I met with a Sanskrit word while reading correspondences to Sri Aurobindo, I had either to show it to him or get somebody's help. I thought this wouldn't do, I must learn at least the alphabet. I put my mind to it and, getting some smattering of it, began to show my learning before him. He started taking interest. When I tried to articulate a word in part, he helped me with the rest as one does with a child. Fortunately I managed, after getting the mother's approval, to learn French also during the break from my work. She said it would be very useful, and so it was, for when some French communications came, I could read them to him. This is roughly the story of the grand epic Savitri traced from the earliest conception to its final consummation. Undoubtedly the first 3 books were of a much higher level of inspiration and nearer perfection than the rest, for with ample leisure, and working by himself he could devote more time and care to that end, which unfortunately could not be said about the rest of the books. Apart from the different versions I have mentioned, there is a huge mass of manuscripts which we have left unclassified since they are in fragments, all of which testifies to the immense labor of a God that has gone into the building of the magnificent epic. For a future research scholar, when Savitri earns as wide a recognition as, for instance, Dante's or Homer's epic, if not more, a very interesting work remains to be done, going into the minutest detail. He would show where new lines or passages have been added, or where one line slightly changed becomes an overhead line, or how another line after various changes comes back to its original version, etc., etc. I was chosen as a scribe probably because I didn't have all these gifts, so that I could, like a passive instrument, jot down faithfully whatever was dictated, while Amal would have raised doubts, argued with him, or been lost in sheer admiration of the beauty and the grandeur. Dilip would have started quoting line after line in rapturous ecstasy before the poem had come out. I submit no apology, nor are my conscience stricken for my failures, for he knew what was the worth of his instrument. I am only grateful to him for being able to serve him with the very faculty which he had evolved and developed in me. We can at last see how from among scattered seeds a single huge banyan tree has grown and spread itself to the transcendent and the cosmic infinite, and excites our perpetual wonder. I wish I could provide a more faithful and vivid picture of its daily growth, a branch here, an offshoot there, trimming the old twigs, reviving the dying ones, discarding the outworn crowding branches till they're soared up into the sky, a majestic vision under whose perennial shade the world can repose a while, in its long journey to the eternal. To show how he expanded the poem, I may quote one long Enu passage which he appended to the end of Book 2, Canto 6, The Kingdoms and the Godheads of the Greater Life. In a high state where ignorance is no more, each movement is a wave of peace and bliss, repose God's motionless creative force. Action a ripple in the infinite, and birth a gesture of eternity. A sun of transfigurations still can shine. And night can bear its core of mystic light, the self-cancelling, self-afflicting paradox into a self-luminous mystery might change, the imbroglio into a joyful miracle. Then God could be visible here, here take a shape, disclosed would be the Spirit's identity. Life would reveal her true immortal face. But now a termless labor is her fate. In its recurrent decimal of events, birth, death appear as its vibrating points. The old question mark margins each finished page, each volume of her efforts history. A limping yes through the eon's journeys still accompanied by an eternal no. All seems in vain, yet endless is the game. Impassive turns the ever-circling wheel, life has no issue, death brings no release. A prisoner of itself the being lives, and keeps its futile immortality, extinction is denied, its soul escape. An error of the gods has made the world, or indifferent the eternal watches time. I desist from giving my own impression of the incomparable epic. I have no such competence, and though I have been made a poet by the master, I leave it to more efficient authorities. One fact alone makes me dumb with a reverent awe and exalted admiration: the colossal labor Sri Aurobindo put forth to build this unique structure. It reminds me of one of those majestic ancient temples like Konarak, or of a Gothic cathedral like Notre Dame, before which you stand and stare in speechless ecstasy. Your soul takes a flight beyond time and space. Before I knew much about Sri Aurobindo, I asked him in my foolish way, why, himself being the master of inspiration and having all higher planes at his command, sending inspiration to others, should he still have to work so hard? With his consciousness entirely silent, he had only to hitch to the right source and words, images, ideas would tumble down in a Brahmaputra of inspiration. To which he answered in his habitual indulgent tone, perhaps a bit piqued by my facile observation, the highest planes are not so accommodating as all that. If they were so, why should it be so difficult to bring down and organize the supermind in the physical consciousness? What happy-go-lucky fancy-web-spinning ignoramuses you all are. You speak of silence, consciousness, overmental, supramental, etc. as if there were so many electric buttons you have only to press and there you are. It may be one day, but meanwhile I have to discover everything about the working of all possible modes of electricity, all the laws, possibilities, perils, etc., construct roads of connection and communication, make the whole far wiring system, try to find out how it can be made foolproof, and all that in the course of a single lifetime. And I have to do it while my blessed disciples are firing off their gay or gloomy a priori reasonings at me from a position of entire irresponsibility, and expecting me to divulge everything to them, not in hints but at length. Lord God in omnibus. Then, with regard to hard labor on Savitri, he wrote, that is very simple. I used Savitri as a means of ascension. I began with it on a certain mental level. Each time I could reach a higher level I rewrote from that level. Moreover, I was particular. If part seemed to me to come from any lower levels, I was not satisfied to leave it because it was good poetry. All had to be as far as possible of the same mint. In fact, Savitri has not been regarded by me as a poem to be written and finished, but as a field of experimentation to see how far poetry could be written from one's own yogic consciousness and how that could be made creative. I did not rewrite Rose of God or the sonnets except for 2 or 3 verbal alterations made at the moment. All this was written to me in 1936. Since then the work proceeded slowly and gradually until between 1939 and 1950 he succeeded to a great extent in achieving what he aimed at, as stated in the letter above. I am sure if he had more time at his disposal and could work by himself, he would have raised it to his ideal of perfect perfection. As it is, Savitri is, I suppose, the example par excellence of the future poetry he speaks of in his book The Future Poetry. Founder of the New Age, pioneer in the field of poetry, as in many others, he has left us an inexhaustible heritage of words, images, ideas, suggestions and hints about which we can only say, here is God's plenty. Rameshwar Gupta very aptly calls it eternity in words. One generation after generation will drink in its soul's nectar from this perennial source. The lifespan of the English language itself has increased 1,000-fold. Shakespeare, it is said, increased the lifespan of the English language by centuries. Sri Aurobindo said about Shakespeare, that kind of spear does not shake everywhere. Now we find another far greater that will shake the world to its very roots. If for no other reason, the English-speaking races ought to be eternally grateful to the supreme poet of the grand epic for this miracle. Sri Aurobindo quoting in the future poetry these lines of an Elizabethan poet, or who can tell for what great work in hand the greatness of our style is now ordained. What powers it shall bring in, what spirits command, writes, it has since brought in many powers, commanded many spirits, but it may be that the richest powers, the highest and greatest spirit yet remain to be found and commanded. I believe that Sri Aurobindo's Savitri fulfills the sovereign potentiality he has foreseen. Dr. Piper of Syracuse University says about Savitri that it already has inaugurated the new age of illumination and is probably the greatest epic in the English language. The most comprehensive, integrated, beautiful and perfect cosmic poem ever composed. It ranges symbolically from primordial cosmic void, through Earth's darkness and struggles, to the highest realms of supramental spiritual existence and illumines every important concern of man, through verse of unparalleled massiveness, magnificence and metaphorical brilliance. Savitri is perhaps the most powerful artistic work in the world for expanding man's mind towards the absolute. The mother has pronounced the last word on Savitri. I quote some extracts from a long talk on it to a young aspirant. He has crammed the whole universe in a single book. It is a marvelous work, magnificent and of an incomparable perfection. You know, before writing Savitri, Sri Aurobindo said to me, I am impelled to launch on a new adventure. I was hesitant in the beginning, but now I am decided. And the day he actually began it, he told me, I have launched myself in a rudderless boat upon the vastness of the infinite. And once having started, he wrote page after page without intermission, as though it were a thing already complete, up there and he had only to transcribe it in ink down here on these pages. It may then be said that Savitri is a revelation, it is a meditation, it is a quest of the infinite, the eternal. Each verse of Savitri is like a revealed mantra which surpasses all that man possessed by way of knowledge and, I repeat this, the words are expressed and arranged in such a way that the sonority of the rhythm leads you to the origin of sound, which is Om. Yes, everything is there, mysticism, occultism, philosophy, the history of evolution, the history of man, of the gods, of creation, of nature, these are experiences lived by him, realities, supracosmic truths. He experienced all these as one experiences joy or sorrow, physically. He walked in the darkness of inconscience, even in the neighborhood of death, endured the sufferings of perdition, and emerged from the mud, the world misery to breathe the sovereign plenitude and enter the supreme Ananda. He crossed all these realms, went through the consequences, suffered and endured physically what one cannot imagine. Nobody till today has suffered like him. He accepted suffering to transform suffering into the joy of union with the Supreme. It is the spiritual path, it is yoga, tapasya, sadhana, everything, in its single body. It is incomparable, it is truth in its plenitude, the truth Sri Aurobindo brought down on the earth. Attendants. We were 6 regular attendants, Pirani, Dr. Beechalal, Dr. Satyendra, Champaklal, Morshankar and myself. Dr. Manilal was an occasional visitor. He used to come, twice or thrice a year and after some weeks' stay he would go back to Baroda. About Dr. Io and Dr. Savor I need not mention more than I have done in their proper context. 3 of us had the opportunity to serve the Master in our medical capacity. Champaklal had been in the Mother's and Sri Aurobindo's personal service since his arrival in 1923, and about Pirani and Satyendra, I will state later what relates to them. Though collected from different fields, we made a harmonious bouquet tied together by the thread of divine grace. 4 of our number have passed away, 1 in a most tragic manner during the Master's lifetime, and the other 3 at a fairly advanced age. As for the rest of us, we are engaged in our individual activities, each serving the Divine Mother in his own way. There is no longer the common center of union, And each being busy with his sadhana, we meet rarely, but the memory kindles up of our old, far-off days whenever we join for a talk, and even when we exchange looks or smiles, the Master seems to be still with us, holding us as before by the magnet of his gracious personality. Some of us were not able to give of our best, human as we are, even our worst surged up now and then, for to be constantly in the physical nearness of the divine Sun with the unregenerate human body is to feel the heat that burns as well as purifies. Nevertheless, each offered, as far as he could, his might and received the royal blessings. Pirani was already known to Sri Aurobindo from the 20s and had enjoyed his closeness during those years. It was thus with him a resumption or the old relation after a lapse of many years. Compared with him, we were youngsters and had the passport of entry by virtue of our medical profession, but some individual contact was established with the Master through correspondence so that he knew each one of us by name at least. In my own case, perhaps, I can go a little further. Had our written contact not been so intimate and various, I do not know if I could have been so free with him and of use to him in diverse ways. I have always wondered at and failed to probe the mystery of that intimacy. I have even imagined that Sri Aurobindo must have seen in his timeless vision that one day this humble self might be physically of some service to him. He prepared me for that eventual day, initiated me into love for poetry that I might at least transcribe his epic savitry from his dictation, gave some intellectual training that I might be useful to him in his literary work. He even made me familiar with his often baffling handwriting so that I could read his manuscripts and decipher them. These may be all weavings of fancy, but if I have been of any help in his intellectual pursuits, most of it was undoubtedly due to his previous coaching through voluminous letters, literary training and above all, his patient and persuasive manner. This long preparation had put out all fear of his awe-inspiring personality and made my approach to him free and almost unconventional, sometimes leading to an unpardonable abuse of that unstinted freedom. Things went on like a song and life would have made itself a transformed vision of the Supreme, but alas, after the novelty of the soul contact had worn off, the other face of our nature, the subconscient, came to light and the pressure of the physical nearness began to tell. Work was no longer a joyous offering, but a duty. Service alone was not a sufficient reward, it needed more concrete spiritual touches, failing which other lesser joys and satisfactions were regarded as legitimate recompense. My old maladies, doubt and depression renewed their hold and transfused into the act of service their bitter stuff. The Master could at once feel the vibration, even though no word was uttered by the lips. Quite often by a look, by a quiet pressure of hands, he would communicate his understanding sympathy and the affliction would withdraw for a time. Never have I seen any displeasure or loss of temper at my delinquency, no harsh word of disapproval though he was quite aware of all inner and outer movements. A largeness, compassionate forgiveness and divine consideration have made life's stream flow through an apparently trackless solitary journey towards the ultimate vastness. I do not know if I have the right to speak of my other colleagues, but of Champaclal particularly I must write a few heartfelt words, for his spirit of service has left an indelible impression on my soul and taught me what true service is. Let me prelude it with the mother's opinion about him when she introduced him to Andre, her son, in 1949. She said with great warmth, "He came here when he was very young. I taught him many kinds of work. He has himself taken up Sri Aurobindo's personal service. He looks into practically everything with regard to Sri Aurobindo. He is extremely careful, meticulous and very particular about details. He has no regular time for food, he takes it when he can. So it is with his sleep. That is why he cannot join the sports activities. He works with joy and devotion. He collects all our little things and keeps them with great care, our clothes, nails, hair, etc. By the very mold of his nature a bhakta, he came into our midst by his innate right, as I have said. Not a bhakta of the traditional type but one who has chosen service as the means of self-expression and fundamental realization. Even the word realization may not be correct, for self-giving alone is what counts with him. Service is his very food. If any of us did his part of the job, he would get annoyed and exclaim, "You are depriving me of my food. I can remain without food but not without work." That sums up Champaclal, and that is exactly the spirit he maintained unflinchingly throughout the long decade that we lived and worked together. The mother had entire trust in him, and putting him in Sri Aurobindo's service along with us, felt quite at ease. Sri Aurobindo also relied on him for all necessary information regarding the mother and other particulars. Once the mother came to Sri Aurobindo's room and sat as usual on the couch opposite. We were just watching. Sri Aurobindo signed to Champaclal, turning his glance towards the mother. Champaclal understood and jumped up and put some cushions at the mother's back. That is their way. I am firmly convinced that through the ages he has been closely connected with the mother and Sri Aurobindo, otherwise how could he have been selected as Sri Aurobindo's personal attendant, even as a young man, as soon as he arrived? When he came to see Sri Aurobindo for the first time, he lay prostrate at his feet for an hour, all bathed in happy tears. And when he was leaving, Sri Aurobindo asked one of his older companions to bring him back with him. It is he who first accepted Sri Aurobindo as the Divine Father and called him Father, accepted the mother as the Divine Mother and began to call her Mother. When he offered to wash the father's clothes, Sri Aurobindo warned him that he would be mocked at, but that did not deter him. He had gone without food and sleep, had not moved from his place lest the master should need something or should even have to wait a minute more. To serve Sri Aurobindo was in one way quite easy, for he would never make any demands on us, was content with the main necessities being met, and he would never express any displeasure if we failed him. This very easiness kept us alert, for one who didn't ask for more than the bare minimum, needed a careful, vigilant watch so that he could be given a little more comfort and ease. Champaclal kept that vigilant eye always. He was more familiar with Sri Aurobindo's nature and temperament by love and long experience, and felt his needs on his very pulse. If he saw that Sri Aurobindo needed some side pillows, he got them made. If his footstool was a bit high or low, he adjusted it to the required height. He put a timepiece by his side, for he knew that Sri Aurobindo was in the habit of frequently seeing the time. Such small things that would pass unnoticed because our imaginative perception was perhaps dull, were caught by his sensitive insight, and he tried to make happy and comfortable the life of the impersonal Brahmin. Sri Aurobindo, when he sat on the edge of the bed and had to wait long for the mother's arrival, seemed to feel drowsy. His body would lean backwards and would then right itself. Still, he would not ask for any assistance, but this, not from any sense of egoism. He would put up with any inconvenience, but if we offered him some help, he did not refuse it. We simply looked on without knowing how to meet the situation, but Champaclal rose to the occasion. He made a pile of pillows to serve as his backrest and to prevent them from tumbling down, supported them from behind. To observe economy due to the war, the mother advised us not to change Sri Aurobindo's bedsheets too often, but if there was a tiny stain on an otherwise clean white sheet, Champaclal would hesitate to use it, saying, "How can we use anything unclean for the Lord?" His making the bed was a sight worth seeing. I wonder if even an expert housewife would do it so perfectly. The bedsheet had not the slightest crease anywhere, it shone with a marble smoothness. In everything his aim was to be flawless. Thus it put others who had to work with him into a very difficult corner. He claimed to have acquired this thoroughness under the apprenticeship of the mother. I sometimes got my share of rebuke from him if I was not tidy or clean enough. "You are a doctor and you still don't wash your hands," he would say. The fact in his case was that over and above his own training he belonged to a very orthodox Brahmin family and had meticulously observed all the practices ordained by the Shastras and enjoined upon the children by his orthodox priest father. We were quite modern people having our own ideas of things, so sometimes clash and conflict would arise. Besides, he was in some parts sensitive like a child. We had to be very careful not to upset him and to spare his feelings as much as we could. He could not understand jokes or any roundabout manner. He told me that Sri Aurobindo had once spoken about this to the mother. It was just after he had settled here. His father wrote a letter to Sri Aurobindo saying that Champaklal's marriage had been fixed, he had only to go, undergo the marriage ceremony and then come back. Sri Aurobindo gravely said, "I suppose we have to send back Champaklal." He was much perturbed to hear it. Then Sri Aurobindo added, "He doesn't understand jokes." He knew, however, how to get things done by the divine. Blessings written on a book, for instance, an autograph on a photo. If asked by Champaklal, Sri Aurobindo would not refuse. The mother too has to accede to the wishes of her bhakta, her most faithful child. One day he conceived the idea of getting Sri Aurobindo's footprints, but how was he to do it without troubling him in any way or without informing him in advance? He had a brainwave. He kept a white sheet of paper and pencil ready. As soon as Sri Aurobindo sat on the chair, he pushed the sheet of paper under his feet and asked, "May I draw your footprint?" Sri Aurobindo not only consented but later wrote love and blessings on the drawing. Let us not forget, by the way, that Champaklal is an artist. Whenever he saw Sri Aurobindo in what seemed to him statuesque poses, his heart would go into rapture and he would call us to share his joy. He would exclaim, "Ah, if a photograph could be taken of this marvelous pose." The mother has said that he has a natural talent already developed to an unusual degree. On one of his birthdays he painted 2 lotuses, white and red, and offered the pictures to the mother. She was very pleased and said she would take them to Sri Aurobindo and ask him to write something. He wrote under the painting of the white lotus, Aditi, the Divine Mother. And the mother wrote on the other, the Avatar. But she forbade Champaklal to show them to anyone, for people would not understand what they meant. Champaklal is the custodian of all their relics such as hair, nails and teeth. He has even stored up all the ashes of the burnt mosquito coils. Here is a humorous incident in connection with the ashes. Once during our evening talks, the mother came in with a telegram asking Sri Aurobindo to send ashes for someone's marriage. We were perplexed for we could not make out the meaning. Pirani had an intuitive flash and said, "It may be the Indian word a with Macron SS for benediction." "Oh, I see," exclaimed Sri Aurobindo. "I was wondering how I was supposed to carry ashes with me, perhaps on my head. Of course I can give them some from Champaklal's mosquito coils. If I had not given up smoking, I could have given some cigar ash. I may as well narrate how I was made the recipient of a favor. Champaklal and I used to attend on Sri Aurobindo when he washed his face and mouth. Once in the course of doing it, he made a gesture of giving me something as I was holding the bowl for gargling. I immediately stretched out my left hand and he softly deposited something without any look or comment. I felt a sudden thrill and drew back into the light to see if it could be a tooth. Yes, it was indeed a whole side tooth. I showed it to Champaklal who was busy doing some work. His eyes rolled in astonishment. Then he extracted from me the story of how I received the extraordinary present. Of course I handed it over to him for safe custody. Later several times he commented on my unusual luck. Or perhaps how he had missed it. Truly speaking, these things belong to his domain, but the divine sometimes oversteps our human roles and rights. Many such instances come to our notice, but since they are more a question of inner perception, no rational proof can be adduced as to their truth. Only the person involved knows that his inner aspiration has found an answer. I will give an illustration. I have stated that when Sri Aurobindo resumed walking, instead of using crutches he leaned on Pirani and Champaklal. After a few months Champaklal alone was retained. He stood on the left side while Sri Aurobindo used a stick on the right. Champaklal would of course never miss his chance as well as his duty. He would not be Champaklal if he did. Now, a desire was growing within me to hold, like him, Sri Aurobindo's arm on my shoulder, at least once. But being by nature a bit shy and fearing that my unsubstantial body would be too weak to bear the divine weight and substance, I stifled my desire before it raised its head. It so happened that one day the mother came for Sri Aurobindo's walk long before the appointed time and Champaklal was not present, only I was there. What to do? To my excited surprise the mother said, "You can give the support." Very cautiously and almost palpitatingly I sat by his left side on the couch and put my right hand around his waist. He put his left arm over my shoulder and stood up. We had hardly taken a round or two when Champaklal arrived running. I could guess what must have been his feeling at that momentous sight. Then I withdrew and he took his place and the master must have felt an immense relief. But a minute's soft velvety touch is unforgettable. If such was my experience, I don't know what Pirani and Champaklal, who had supported the Lord for months, must have felt. Somebody rightly appreciated the value of the touch when he said that Champaklal's shoulders should be wrapped in gold. Each one of us had his chance, as we called it. Whatever we had inwardly aspired for had its proper response and he who received it could alone testify to the truth of the phenomenon. Yatha mam prapadayanti. 1. This is the divine play between the devotee and the Lord. I shall quote another instance at the risk of being mocked at by the rationalists and being dubbed an apostate, for was I not once a materialist myself? As I have said, Sri Aurobindo used to take a peppermint pastille while he was dictating Savitri and Champaklal's role was to offer it, when wanted. He would wait and wait even if not called at the due hour. He would sometimes hurry his meal so as not to miss the occasion. I thought, why should I not get one chance, at least? But my friend would hear the call even if it was whispered and would run from wherever he might be in the room. Here again, Sri Aurobindo consciously or unconsciously responded to my silent wish by asking one day for the pastille much earlier in the usual time, when Champaklal was not present. He came up and waited for the call. I put on a very innocent face though now and again a mischievous smile tried to betray it. Then at last, very much piqued, Champaklal asked me, "What's the matter?" "He is not asking for the pastille." I could not help breaking into laughter. He understood but inquired exactly when he had asked, who had given it, etc., etc. All these incidents were our little pranks played among ourselves and between us and the master. I shall not protest if anyone calls me too credulous and finds these as nothing but sentimental outpourings of bhaktas. These instances do illustrate why I call Champaklal a real bhakta and have looked upon his service as having the true spirit. No wonder that the Lord, during his last hours, amply recompensed him by repeatedly embracing him, to our great bewildered delight. Some critics might find this a very rosy picture of Champaklal, drawn, as one would expect, by a colleague who would keep the thorns out of their sight. Thorns he has, who has not? In 1935, when I knew very little of him, I wrote to Sri Aurobindo. Champaklal came to the dispensary and had an outburst with me. I am sure he will tell the mother about it. He replied, Champaklal does not usually tell mother about these things. Outbursts of that kind are too common with him. And when heat meets heat, it is almost midsummer now. Champaklal is himself aware of his defects and repents them very much. Sometimes on the verge of despair, he confesses that complete change of nature is impossible except by the divine grace. More than once after losing his temper with me, not always without cause, he regretted his explosion and said, "I hope you won't mind, you know my nature," and became his old sweet self. He has a streak of Bholanath in him, and says that he must have been an avid one in his previous life. He has prayed again and again to the mother for the removal of this weakness in his nature. He is outspoken, very straightforward. The mother has vouched for it. He cannot bear any kind of insincerity. He cannot make or even see any compromise made with falsehood. His nature is alien to the ways of the world. Much of his apparent rudeness and ill temper stems from this uncompromising spirit. This, of course, does not save him from misjudging people at times, but when shown his fault, he never tries to cover it up. I believe that there should be someone who is upright and unsparing, and as firm as steel when all around there is such a mixture of motives. He serves as the gatekeeper of heaven. Parodying Sri Aurobindo's verse, "None can reach heaven who has not passed through hell," I would mutter, "None can go to the mother who has not passed through Champaklal." To make the path easy to heaven, or at least to get heaven's blessings more easily, is also possible by his intervention. If the mother is at times reluctant for some reason to give a birthday card to someone or write a person's name or love and blessings on it, if she refuses to see another on his birthday, Champaklal appeals to her divine compassion and makes her rescind her decision. The mother sometimes asks him, "What shall I write?" "Why, love and blessings, mother," is his reply. He says that he suffered a lot in his childhood because people could not understand his nature. He now wants to distribute the divine's largesse whenever and wherever he can. Many people are grateful to him for procuring the mother's blessings for them, especially her physical touch. Only one must be frank and straightforward. Sometimes he has gone out of his way to help even an unknown and unpresuming person to get the mother's touch if he thought that he had been overlooked. To sum up, his soul's mission is to serve the mother, to look after her and to make her love and compassion available to all, rich or poor, worthy or unworthy, young or old, without any distinction. I shall now conclude my rosy picture of Champaklal by quoting Sri Aurobindo's estimate of him: "All have their defects, but Champaklal has great qualities to atone for them." Morshankar, youngest of the group, was the brother of Esculape, alias Dayashankar, at one time in charge of the ashram dispensary. He also worked as an assistant in the dispensary after Esculape's retirement and came to serve Sri Aurobindo as a medical aid. An excellent worker, he had the privilege of massaging Sri Aurobindo's body for a certain period. He was no masseur and in fact knew nothing about it, but he picked it up from some casual lessons and was gifted with the natural lightness and suppleness of finger movements. During the short interval that Sri Aurobindo had to wait for the mother to come, before he started walking, Morshankar would sit behind and apply a good massage to his back. It was really as if an expert masseur was at work. His hands moved so lightly and fast, up and down the back and spine, sometimes using delicate finger strokes or the edge of the palms and swinging and bending the body as the various movements demanded and then finishing off with very gentle touches of the fingertips. One was tempted to take a photograph of his agile figure and beaming face visibly moved beyond measure by the unique privilege of touching the Lord's body, while Sri Aurobindo kept on sitting like a statue looking downwards as massage proceeded, or in front, sometimes smiling by himself, perhaps oblivious of all the 100 kinds of fleeting, fluttering, striking movements being made on his back. Both the figures supplied us food for a good deal of merriment, the guru sitting on the edge of the bed, the shishya briskly massaging his back. But the poor fellow had to miss his service because of an intractable headache that crippled him often. And every time that happened we would report to Sri Aurobindo. His comment would be, "Again," or an exclamatory expression. We could feel at the same time that the inner help was being given. What could be more heartrending than that he lost his life at the hands of an assassin during the riot of 1947? When the news was brought to Sri Aurobindo that he had been fatally stabbed, the air was filled with gloom. Sri Aurobindo listened quietly and his face bore a grave and serious expression that we had not seen before. The dark forces seemed to have achieved a perilous victory in snatching away one of the personal attendants of the divine. Such is the grim occult struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. For days we were under a pall of gloom and none of us referred to the incident in our talks. Such appalling mist could only be dissolved by counterbalancing incidents like the one of our old Dr. Beechalal, a true bhakta by nature. Sri Aurobindo remarked that his bhakti was genuine. How many times he was on the point of shedding tears on seeing his Bhagawan suffer. Apart from his age, his emotional nature rendered him incapable of doing anything but light work and we gave him only such work. Neither would he ask for more, since he knew himself quite well. If he could just breathe the nearness of the Lord, that was all he wanted. That was his lifelong aspiration. It appeared, and it was fulfilled. He was called Dadaji by us and given his due respect. During the early days of the accident, in the tranquil atmosphere of the room, we would hear some sudden sobbing trying in vain to control itself. It was our doctor who had been moved to sorrow by the painful condition of his beloved Lord. Or sometimes there were tears of spiritual fervor. When after his bath Sri Aurobindo lay down for a little rest, our doctor would squat behind or beside him and gaze on the reclining god who was in serene repose with both hands locked above the head. Bichalal said that at those moments especially, Sri Aurobindo appeared to him just like Lord Shiva and he felt a great impulse to embrace him. Stretched at full length on the bed, his well-formed body almost filling it without any covering on the upper part, the large full head and the radiant face, caring nothing for earthly vanities, yet the Lord of the world, captured not only Dr. Bichalal's heart but ours as well. Dr. Bichalal would be full of peace and rapture in his presence but could not stay long because of his old age infirmities. Dr. Manilal remarked to Sri Aurobindo that among all of us Dr. Bichalal profited most from his association with Sri Aurobindo. Coming as a sharp contrast to Dr. Bichalal, Dr. Manilal was in every way a sound practical man. Since he spent most of his time away in Baroda, his personal service had to be limited. Both the doctors had been connected with the ashram for a long time and Dr. Bichalal had served under Dr. Manilal in Baroda before he came here. There is no doubt that Manilal's devotion was also genuine, though of a different kind, less emotional and more practical. His approach to Sri Aurobindo was easy and spontaneous and his manner with us was always sweet and affable. It had none of the superior airs that one is accustomed to meet in a senior colleague. He took our playful jokes and banterings with good grace and was ever inquiring when the supermind was going to descend. I have stated in the chapter on talks that he had a child's soul in him, and in my book Talks with Sri Aurobindo there are quite a number of glimpses of that trait. I will quote here one or two examples. Apropos of a discussion on sadhana, Sri Aurobindo said, "You want an easy path. Manilal, more than an easy path, we want to be carried about like babies." Not possible, sir. Sri Aurobindo, why not? But you have to be a genuine baby. Smiling, meditating. Manilal, trying hard, sir. Many undesirable things come to disturb me. Sri Aurobindo, what are they? Manilal, some nonsense. Sri Aurobindo, some extraordinary nonsense like thoughts of perpetual attendance on your Maharaja patron or of the likely successor to Mussolini. Manilal, no, sir. Thoughts of the Maharaja come very rarely. Another example, Sri Aurobindo asked the doctor, "Do you always have to try to meditate?" Manilal, not always. I have told you that sometimes it visits me all of a sudden. But was I right in saying that I was able to reject thoughts? Sri Aurobindo, smiling, how do I know? I was only making comments on your statements. Manilal, you don't know. We consider you omniscient. Sri Aurobindo, you don't expect me, surely, to know how many fishes the fishermen of Pondicherry have caught. Dr. Satyendra is an unassuming and nice person, did his part of the job in a quiet and steady way. He was cleaning, for a time, the windows and furniture in Sri Aurobindo's room. Ready to serve but never pushing and not over-eager, he kept a closeness and happy relation with all. He used to express very often that he was more of a retiring nature and more intent on personal realization through bhakti. Karma yoga did not suit his temperament very well. Whatever might be his particular bent, we saw that he did his own work like a karma yogi, in a genuine spirit of service to the master whom he always addressed as Sir. His talks with Sri Aurobindo showed his sense of humor, his insight into philosophy, politics and mysticism. Sri Aurobindo seemed to like his company, his quiet devotion, in spite of his constantly grumbling against the integral yoga and the supermind. While cleaning the master's nails as he lay in bed, he would start his old unvarying tale about the necessity of the personal touch, his close contact with his former guru. Sri Aurobindo would listen quietly to his nostalgic monologue. There must be some expression of love, was his constant burden, to which Sri Aurobindo once replied that unity of consciousness is the root and love is its fine flower. A shrewd observer of human and divine nature, it was he who made the pertinent remark that in this yoga only two persons have achieved complete surrender, the mother to Sri Aurobindo and Sri Aurobindo to the mother. As an example, he related this story. Sri Aurobindo was lying in bed one day, and the ceiling fan was revolving at full speed. Satyendra felt that he wanted something, so he approached the master and asked, "Are you looking for something, sir?" "Oh, no." "Is Nirod there?" "No, sir." "But can I do anything?" he asked. "I was wondering if the speed of the fan could be reduced," he replied. "I can do it, sir." "Oh, can you?" he asked. Sri Aurobindo inquired about me because I was given charge of the fan by the mother, and he would not violate the rule. As for the reduction of the speed, that too was in deference to the wishes of the mother, for once on entering Sri Aurobindo's room, she saw the fan turning at full speed and remarked, "Oh, what a storm." To give another instance, when we wanted to move the table fan a bit nearer him, he said, "No, mother has kept it there." This is how we learnt submission and obedience, not only in big matters, but even in small trivialities. The mother told Satyendra recently on his birthday that Sri Aurobindo had come to her on the eve of his interview with her and said that he had taken good care of Sri Aurobindo's body. What a touching recognition from Sri Aurobindo. Even after leaving the body, the Guru remembers a kind act, some help rendered to him by his disciple. What a divine magnanimity! We know also that all those who had served him during his accident period have had their reward in some form or other, in the material and spiritual life. Pirani, the last to be mentioned of our group, was one of the old guards associated with Sri Aurobindo from the 20s. I shall not speak much about him because his own books tell in every line what profound love and adoration he bore for the master for whose sake he would do anything. Full of life and gusto, he added a liveliness to our company. His choice of the unearthly hours from 2 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. for service was a great relief to us. He would surge up from the bosom of the night and say, "Here I am." He had the entire period to himself and kept awake while we were contentedly sleeping and snoring by his side. Now and then we used to hear, as if in a dream, Sri Aurobindo's soft voice asking for something and Pirani with military steps advancing and responding to the call of the general. If you happened to wake up by some inadvertent noise, you would find a different figure altogether, moving in the penumbra. No longer that lively, youngish spirit, but a very serious face that does not recognize anything else but the work, and brooks no meddling in his duty when Sri Aurobindo is his sole monopoly. I realized then why he chose that hour for service. He could be concentrated, watchful and all alone with the master. The midnight surely affects all of us with its portentous weight. Another distinctive feature in his service was his physical strength, without which it would have been difficult to lift or carry Sri Aurobindo during the early days of the accident. We have seen how he served as a solid human crutch on Sri Aurobindo's right side, and later on, his giant manipulation of the large hand fan was no less an achievement. His tremendous vital energy would take little account of things big or small. It would either dash against the door or kick at a poor matchbox. The noise would make Sri Aurobindo remark, "What's the matter?" "It is Pirani," we would reply in fun and evoke his smile. He knew Pirani's nature very well. Once when Pirani hurt his big toe, Sri Aurobindo remarked, "You are always dropping things or knocking against them." He even referred our jokes to the mother at Pirani's cost. But see him again sitting on the floor with big volumes by his side. How serious his whole demeanor is. An erudite Sanskrit scholar at work. Sri Aurobindo, sitting on the bed, leaning against the backrest, asks him to find out the root of some Vedic word and its various derivative meanings. Pirani forages through the dictionaries or Sayana's commentaries, reads them aloud and notes them down. The master dictates the interpretations of a hymn in a low voice, sometimes looks at him or makes some further inquiry, resting his left elbow on the side cushion which is tending to slide down, and he puts it back in its position. Meanwhile, if he needs anything, he casts a glance behind to see if anyone is nearby, and resumes his dictation. The disciple, serious and docile, obeys the master's bidding. Apropos of Sayana, Sri Aurobindo said in a talk, Sayana, in spite of his many mistakes, is very useful, though it is like going to ignore ants for knowledge. I added, Pirani, with his shining bald head, some locks of white hair, his glasses resting on the tip of his sharp nose and fat volumes by his side, looks very much like Sayana. Sri Aurobindo replied, Oh, Sayana came back to undo his mischief. At another time he is like a press reporter, bubbling with news gathered from all quarters, particularly from the town. He arrives and Sri Aurobindo, looking at him, asks, Any news? Then the talks begin. Sometimes Pirani is late and the master inquires, Where is Pirani? Often forgetting his gravity, Pirani becomes a child and joins us in a plot, when there is nothing to talk about, to draw out Sri Aurobindo, who might himself be waiting for the occasion. The ball is set rolling by Pirani repeating, for instance, Nirod says that his mind is getting dull and stupid. On other occasions he starts serious discussions on modern painting, modern poetry, philosophy, politics, history, science and what not. There is hardly any subject on which he cannot say something. A versatile man indeed, and a very interesting personality. Once in the evening the guru and the shishya had a long talk, for more than an hour, on an old legal case, Boput case, that must have taken place during Sri Aurobindo's stay in Baroda, and must have been famous for Pirani to remember it and discuss it with Sri Aurobindo. He was lying on one side and Pirani was sitting on the floor leaning against a couch opposite. It had the air of a very homely talk, as between father and son. Anybody who had seen the master only during the darshan could never conceive of this Sri Aurobindo who had put off his mantle of majesty and high impersonality. I stood for a while to listen to the discussion, but found it so dull that I began wondering how they could drag on ad infinitum. It was Pirani's versatility that enriched much in our talks with the master. If, however, by any chance you stepped on his toes, the old lion growled and roared. But wherever Sri Aurobindo's interest was involved, he would not spare himself. The Guru's name acted on him like a mantra. The Aurobindonians are ever grateful to him for his yeoman service in bringing out so many valuable documents on Sri Aurobindo's early life in England and for trying to get his genius recognized by the English intellectual circle. One other casual attendant whose name I should include was Dr. Sonyal. He was an eminent surgeon in Calcutta and his active service was called for when Sri Aurobindo's condition became critical in the first week of December, 1950. He was sent an urgent wire to come immediately. Before this he had Sri Aurobindo's private darshan twice. The first occasion was when I consulted him in the beginning about Sri Aurobindo's illness. Next year, when again he visited the ashram, his contact with Sri Aurobindo was renewed for the same reason. Each time he stayed for about a week and every day he had the Guru's darshan. He would come dressed in simple white dhoti and Punjabi with a big bouquet of lotuses or roses and offer his pranam to the Guru in quiet devotion. Then, as Sri Aurobindo sat on the bed, he, kneeling on the floor, massaged his leg and held long talks with him at the same time. Sri Aurobindo's manner was affable and engaging, bearing a smile that egged on the speaker. Once I heard from a distance the mother talking to Sri Aurobindo about him. From a few words that caught my ear it seemed she was very much impressed by his deportment and physiognomy. I felt that she had already marked him as one of her future instruments. All these paved the way to his last service to his lord and permanent service to the mother. Besides Pavitra and Ayuman, who used to come to clean the carpeted floor, the former at the beginning only, I might mention another Sardak, Udar, who came daily to clean the new furniture in Sri Aurobindo's room since 1947. He had also helped us greatly in procuring medicines for Sri Aurobindo during the last days of his illness, and he was present at the moment of his departure. Here is his own account regarding his attendance. Now, in 1939, after Sri Aurobindo's accident, it was felt that the furniture he was using had to be replaced by something better. It was mostly made of boxwood. So the mother gave me the great privilege of designing and making the furniture for his room, which was done in rosewood but the bed in teak wood. It is the furniture that is there today. Then, when the furniture, well polished with wax, not French polish, was installed, the mother gave me another great privilege, that of cleaning and polishing the new furniture. I was permitted 1 hour a day for this. This is how I came into personal contact with Sri Aurobindo, except for the darshans we had before. These were happy days for me. I chose the daily hour differently, sometimes when the mother and others were with him, sometimes when he would be dictating Savitri to Nirod. This was really a great thing for me, and I treasure the memory very dearly. Sri Aurobindo did not speak much or often, but I heard him on several subjects. He did not speak to me directly except a few times, and the memory of this is very precious. I had, however, the great good fortune of being able to make my private pranams to him on darshan days and lay my head in his lap and look closely into his eyes. But otherwise, except for being in his immediate presence for an hour each day, I did not have close contact with him. One day, however, a few days before his passing, I found him looking at me very closely and intensely with such a love and compassion that passes all description. I was alone with him at the time. I did not know why he was looking at me so, but I was so carried away with joy by the love he showered on me in his look that I did not bother about the reason for it. It was only later, when comparing notes with the others who served him personally, that I discovered that he was bidding me a physical goodbye. He had done the same to others, to each differently, and, it seems, each one was puzzled at the time. But when he left us physically soon after, we guessed the reason. Talks. Those who have read Talks with Sri Aurobindo or Evening Talks must have realized that Sri Aurobindo was not a world-averse yogi lost in rapturous silence of the Brahman like the Maharshi, nor talked, when he did, mostly of spiritual matters as did Ramakrishna. In fact, our talks covered a vast range of subjects, they had almost a global dimension. We wondered at his enormous knowledge in so many fields. Considering the shortness of the period during which he lived in strenuous contact with the external world, one would be tempted to ask how much of this knowledge was the outcome of his practical worldly experience and how much a result of yoga. In a letter to me he had said, "Don't try to throw allopathic dust in my eyes, sir. I have lived a fairly long time and seen something of the world before my retirement and much more after it." So yoga must have opened to his vision thoughts that wander through eternity and made him the possessor of infinite knowledge, secular as well as spiritual. World after world bursts on the awakened sight, he says in one of his sonnets. He has attributed all that he had become to the effect of yoga. In one of our talks we were staggered to hear him profess that even if he had written 10 times more than he had done, his knowledge would have remained unexhausted. And when we murmured in a sad protest that such a vast amount of knowledge would be lost to us, he replied, "Practice first what I have written." On another occasion, when he was asked by a Sardak how he could manage to write on 7 subjects at a time in the Arya, he replied that he could write 7 issues of the Arya every month for 70 years and still the knowledge that came from above would hardly be exhausted. The mother also said that he wrote the Arya from a completely silent mind. Everything came right down on the typewriter. Otherwise it would not have been possible to write 64 pages every month. Strictly speaking, it was only in the last week of the month that he would get down to writing. Amrita had been asked to remind him about the Arya, a week before its time for the press. When he gave the signal, Sri Aurobindo would start the Herculean labor and finish it with utmost ease. Those words from a sonnet of his, "I have drunk the infinite like a giant's wine," are a testimony to this bewildering fact. Now at this fountainhead of wisdom and yogic illumination we had the rare opportunity to drink day and night for a number of years. If we could not get more, it was not because he had closed the channel, but rather that our small vessels could not contain more. One can then understand that next to his silent human divine presence, his talks were the most coveted feature of our close association with him. Yet they came so unexpectedly, for Sri Aurobindo, as we had come to know and see him during the darshan, had succeeded in building in our minds a picture of him high-poised as his life divine, far-moving as his synthesis of yoga, unapproachable, except perhaps by the gods, not at all close and intimate like his essays on the Gita or accessible to our mortal longings. Of course, a few of us had the extraordinary good fortune of knowing his human side through his inestimable correspondence, on the strength of which I wrote to him, "You thrashed me for calling you grave and austere at the darshan time. But see, when we go to the mother, how seraphically she smiles, while your noble self being near, appears still far away at some Olympian height. It is difficult to discern the gravity or the jollity of a face at such a height. I suppose our conception of the gods was formed from the vision of such a figure." He replied, "Neither gravity nor jollity, but a large, easy, quiet, amiable condition. The gods can't be amiable." And it was this amiable aspect that came to the forefront in our talks. We came to know much later that Sri Aurobindo used to hold table talks in the pre-ashram days, with his few young followers. But I believe ours were an advance on those talks by the ease, the informality, the natural diversity and intimacy of communication due to the exceptional circumstances in which they were held. Sri Aurobindo had no need of vocal self-expression, either in our time or before. It is my conviction that the interchange with us was an act of compassion to entertain us in return for the medical attendance we had been called upon to render him. I may add here that any personal service offered to Tiwidiniverimfti, a towe fviestsvil, dbarisan gosf adnisak mompleritwana. Submission to medical rigors, he had adjusted himself to the new mode of life. The talks started. At first they were in the form of medical inquiries. Dr. Manilal would come up in the morning, for he was living outside the ashram compound, and stand with folded hands before Sri Aurobindo who lay in bed. After pranam he would ask, smiling, "How are you, sir? Did you sleep well?" To which Sri Aurobindo's answers were genially brief.